So can each of you start off by talking about an experience that made you think harder about the importance of investing in security, right, within your organizations? It doesn't have to be in your current role, right? And if that experience led you to getting a solution which was probably provided by a cybersecurity startup, right? And what that experience taught you, right? As in, like, did you consider companies who were startups? Did you end up buying from them? Was that a good experience, bad experience? So can you start us off, maybe, Anand, if you don't mind, like talking about, like, hey, sometime where we had a priority within the organization where you essentially went outside of the bound of just buying from a Symantec or a Palo Alto, but you said, like, hey, no, I don't think they're doing best of class work. I need to achieve this outcome using what I can find from someone outside of them.
Absolutely. So I have had the privilege of giving two very large companies their jumpstart in the early part of their tenures. ArcSight was a small company at one point, only 50 people or so, and I was a target corporation at that point of time. And we were standing up our e-commerce practice. So for those of you who don't know, Target's e-commerce site was fully hosted on Amazon for a very, very long time. And then Target realized that Amazon was learning retail on them. So they wisened up to it, and they moved their entire infrastructure into their wholly owned environment. And as a part of that exercise, one of the gaps that I identified was that we don't have a great way to correlate all the security events and all the information that is happening. And ArcSight was a very small company at that point of time, an independent company not owned by HP at that point of time. I know, Micro Focus. So I actually sat down with ArcSight. We spent a significant amount of time with them. What excited me about them at that point of time was the fact that they were thinking big, they were executing well, and they were thinking big. So it's not like they had analysis paralysis where they were thinking about everything that they could do and in the process not doing much. What they were thinking was, these are the things that I need to deliver now, these are the higher priority items. I will build a product around those higher priority items, and then I will build up on that by all the other log sources and correlation possibilities with all the other log sources. So I like the fact their execution-oriented mindset combined with a vision for the future where the product continues to evolve and become greater and greater over time. So we made the bet on ArcSight, and it panned out well, and over time, as everyone knows, ArcSight became the dominant player. Probably not anymore because many other technologies have come since then, but ArcSight at one point was the dominant player in the SIEM space and found a lot of traction in the marketplace. The second example I would give very quickly is that this is from a large healthcare experience, and Gaurav will probably appreciate this. But this was about privilege management. Privilege is everything in healthcare. Who has access to what data? No great solutions existed for privilege management, particularly when privileged peoples were doing specific actions on healthcare data. So we partnered with a little company at that point of time, CyberArk. It was still based out of Israel at that point of time. And we worked with them. It was a very complex product, so I think in the process of working with us, CyberArk learned how to manage the complexity such that it becomes easier to deploy and it becomes easier to execute. So long story short, we taught them how to implement for a large enterprise. They gave us a great deal. It was a win-win for both the parties.
Yeah, I think those are great examples, and they resonate with me because my experience has generally been large enterprise. I've not worked personally in a lot of smaller companies, and at large enterprise, you tend to end up with problems that are unique. Maybe they're not as common, and so the market doesn't necessarily cater to them directly. And so being able to work with a startup or an early stage company, being able to be that sort of design partner that you talk about, I've had the opportunity to do that several times in my career. I won't name the companies because they don't exist anymore. It's probably bad. They were acquired, which is great for them. But one example that jumps to my mind is dealing with unstructured data and attempting to find that and quantify and protect it. This pre-DLP. And it's just being able to find somebody who has a vision that aligns with yours and being able to collaborate with them and turn that problem into a product. That's tremendously valuable I think for both parties. And like you said, it gives them opportunity to a learning laboratory that is much beyond normal reach for a startup kind of company.
So, like Drew, I probably don't have too much exposure into the startup world, but there's a few startups that I remember working on quite early in my career. Actually, I was fortunate enough to start my career at an oil and gas services company called Schlumberger, and they had this internal think tank that purely focused on developing ideas for the next 5 years, the 10 years. And somehow I got planted into that think tank, and we just worked on birds of a feather ideas and see how we could productize them, make them revenue earning bill of materials, if you will, for the organization. So I'm not sure if this company actually exists or not, but the problem that we were trying to solve at that time was real-time collaboration between all of the various sectors of Schlumberger. Schlumberger is into the business of finding oil and drilling the well and then selling that well to an Exxon or Shell or what have you. So they had their geo-research functions, they had their PhD scientists who were looking at all the geography, they had their research vessels that would actually go out into the oceans and actually drill the holes, and then so on and so forth. So there was this unique requirement being able to share this information in real time. And I'm sure all of you know how valuable these oil reserves are. So the point of the whole problem was that how do we do this security? So that's when I really understood that we need to be able to protect this information in such a way that we can actually make money off it for not just for the next 12 months, 24 months, but for the next few decades, if you will. That's how expensive this information is. So this company that I worked with, I'm not sure again they're around or not, but it was a Norwegian company called Appgate. And this company actually specialized in how they could do end-to-end encryption. Today when we talk about WhatsApp being or Facebook doing end-to-end encryption, it's still like, oh, okay, right? But I'm talking about in the year 1999, 2000, when we were doing this end-to-end encryption where connection from the ship terminal to a geo-research center in Austin, Texas, to an engineering firm who's actually producing or diagnosing the problems in the equipment was a very tough problem to solve. So this organization helped us put together and secure that channel in ways and means that we could not only do real-time sharing, but also have voice communication across the secure channel. The other startup that I worked with, they are still around. They're around the lines of real-time data analytics. It's called Interset. Really, really smart organization. I think they get the problems that businesses are feeling and facing on a day-to-day basis by having all these disparate data sources being brought into a data lake of sod. And I think organizations are getting pretty good at aggregating the data, but what we do from that aggregated data is a totally different ballgame, right? And this is where organizations, a very small company, Canadian company, and some of the heuristics that they have actually been able to put together in the last few years have really been, have helped us, I shouldn't say our organization, but in a previous role, helped us to intelligize that data and actually make sense out of it in ways and means where we could actually create predictive models out of it. So hope that helps, and pass it on to.
Sure. So we were solving a cybersecurity problem, but we were doing it with an IT operations management solution. Our problem was we didn't have good visibility into our assets, so you can't really protect what you can't see. So the product that we used at the time was called Vistara. It's called OpsRamp now. It's an IT operations management platform. We still use them today. They've been integral to our success, both security and our IT worlds. I think the big challenges for us in starting out was they were not very well known, and we were taking a big bet on them as far as the financial investment we were making, and we had to we didn't have, and we still don't, frankly, have a good startup program within our organization just because of the regulatory and compliance requirements we have and the velocity at which we move. We can't really lower the bar for some of those processes, so we kind of had to push on our vendor management team to accept the organization. I basically had to sign my career on the bottom of that contract, which thankfully it worked out for us very well. But it's boring stuff, I guess. It's not sexy. The asset management, monitoring, patching, things of that nature, but we were actually bringing all of it into one pane of glass and one process and one automation framework, and still working for us today. It's been very successful, and we continue to part with them, and I think we probably made them as successful as they've made us.
I think what's fascinating is, like, sitting in Texas, you have 4 senior leaders acknowledging that, hey, there are gaps which not a lot of large companies are looking to solve, and we have to go outside and get someone who's interested in solving that problem for us, right? And I think where I wanted to take the conversation was, people say software is eating the world, right? Like, we were in Detroit last week and we were talking about how much what goes in a car is now dependent on, like, what you're actually building into the systems, right? And I think it's intersecting all our businesses, right? Banking, right? Insurance, marketing. As you think about that outcome that you are enabling for your customer, right? In banking, as in, like, secure transaction, right? Like in insurance, like making sure, like, people have their data managed correctly, right? Similar at Epsilon as well. Are you seeing the need for investing or doubling down on product security, right? Enabling product security, enabling the security of that main product that you have. Like, so there's the general sense of, like, overall security hygiene for a company, right? But then there is, like, hey, the outcome of my organization building great engineering products is only going to go so far if it's not secure, right? Because, like, you're one hack away from being put out of business, right? And so with that context, can you talk a little more about, like, the importance of investing in product security within your current organization, right? And if you've created any process for how you actually come up with, like, identifying people you want to work with, how you integrate these things, like maybe as part of your SDLC process, like your development lifecycle, right? Can you talk a little more about, like, what that structure looks like from an organizational aspect, as well as, like, if, I mean, you guys all had examples, interesting examples of, like, companies you work with, right? What is it that you're looking within, when you're thinking about, like, hey, this is a set of team that I'm super excited that they're trying to solve the problem, what are the red flags, right? So I'm breaking this up, and maybe we can actually come back around, but Robert, if you want to engage the audience specifically on, like, hey, the importance of product security, we can come back to my second question.
Sure, and I can answer both of them. We've been on a product security journey internally for a couple of years now because we're a product company, and we realized we couldn't do product security without having an organizational function that provided that. We have a couple of different models based on the maturity of the organization. We have dotted lines, and we have your solid line, and it just depends on, the organization's maturity. But we had to have a product security liaison that was either embedded within the team or was still on our team. So we have both versions of that, and you just can't maintain, there's so much nuance and complexity within the product itself, you can't kind of manage that from effectively manage that from a centrally managed security function. So we have those product security liaisons that we've been embedded in within the teams, which has been very successful, and the ones that are owned by the team are more successful because they have accountability and they pay their salaries. But we're continuing to push that direction to kind of decentralize that function. The challenge has been, and our challenge has always been with security, is is time, the allocation of time. They don't allocate enough time in the design process for security. They don't allocate enough time in the operational process for security. So you always come back around, as we all know, it gets exponentially more difficult to manage something once it gets into production than doing it up front. So our goal has been through training, whether it's code scanning, secure code training up front, so we're doing those scans both before pre-deployment and post-deployment, and then that constant training again with having our folks having that kind of built into their DNA along with that product security function.
complicated. I'd echo that. You know, specifically the organizational alignment. Product security for our company means everything from circuit board design. You know, we do our own silicon design and fab, all the way up to the software that does things like software-defined networking. And so it's a really broad swath of technology, and it would be impossible for a single organization to really collect all of that expertise. We have kind of a governance model versus an embed model. We roll up the output of our product security into a senior leadership forum that checks the metrics, make sure that all the SDL processes are properly implemented, defined, trained, et cetera, looks at the outcome of the development process and so forth. It's a big focus for us. Interestingly, it's also an area that we use startups to support. We have, within HPE, we have an organization called Pathfinder, which is a venture investment firm, kind of like you were talking about with Schlumberger. And we've invested in among others, a penetration testing company called Synac. And so we've embedded that into our product and into our IT app development lifecycle as well. So it's an opportunity again where you know, they had an interesting model for penetration testing, which was different than your more traditional consultancies, and so, you know, we thought it was solving a problem in a way that was novel and interesting, and so invested in and use.
So I totally echo what Robert and Drew already shared. I think the two things that I'd like to add to here is, one is that the InfoSec organization will not know everything, may not know all the ins and outs of the application or the product that you're building. It's the architects, the engineers who are actually building that application who know the intricacies and the complexities built into the product. So one of the things that I have done previously in my career is working with the app development, the solution development teams, and helping them understand cyber. Why is this a risk, and understanding the implications of it? Because most people, you know, everybody, if you walk around your organization, nobody wants to do a bad thing when it compares to, as it deems to cybersecurity. They all believe cybersecurity is an important component of the organization, but yet they may not have the tools or the knowledge to be able to do the right thing. So creating a cyber awareness campaign, not just once, but having a continuous awareness, continuous education program with these folks who are in the trenches building it has been really helpful. The second part that, you know, and Drew already talked about it, where we can leverage some of the startups and smaller organizations, is having pen testing, right? Actually, even before having pen testing, I think as an InfoSec team, are we doing threat modeling for all these products and services that we're actually building out? Being able to look at the solution architecture and be able to say, okay, well, what if I break this thing? How will it impact the rest of the platform? So having a good threat modeling exercise before, at each stage, and not just a one-point threat modeling, but as this design is being progressed through the development side of the house, you are having a continuous threat modeling exercise with the product development team, so that way we are able to identify any malpractices, if you will, and be able to fix them without having to compromise and then say, hey, this is a risk exception, and therefore please let it go because we need to meet this particular deadline. And then the third part is active pen testing, right? Most organizations are wary about doing pen testing because they may expose the holes that they may not want to know about. But I'd rather find my own holes before some bad guy finds it, right? So being very open to the fact that, hey, there's an organization that would come in and you know, basically beat up the platform and help you identify the weaknesses. Now, the only caution that I would say is that have active rules of engagements between when you're doing pen testing. Because a lot of times when you not defined the rules of engagement, things go across those boundaries and actually cause a lot of business impact, which then prevents from business leadership to say, no, I do not want a pen test done on this platform because of X, Y, and Z reasons. So when you have rules of engagement, what can you do, when can you do, how far can you go? That's when pen testing really becomes an enabler. I think there was this recent article a few months back where this hacker was arrested for doing some pen testing, And I was like, wow, I didn't know cyber could be that dangerous of a field. But
Super lucrative, right, for hackers, like to take advantage of like gaps in people's holes. But like I think there's a sprawling industry of like, you know, you think about gig workers. This is a gig for people, right? I mean, this is a lifestyle. So Anand,
Yeah, well, I just want to mention one more thing too in that vein, and in the vein of gig workers is running a bug bounty program.
oh, yeah.
yeah.
You know, if you're developing a product that's going to the consumer, any kind of consumer, you know, the bug bounty program is a real significant way to get feedback on a real, and again, for some people, six-figure incomes are, you know, to be expected.
So before I jump into the answer to this question, I do want to pick up a thread from Robert, who said asset management is not sexy. I think every guy in here would give an arm and a leg to get a clean inventory of assets for their enterprise. That's probably one of the foundational things that you can do to improve security of the enterprise. But coming to this point here, I think product security is essential. And in some ways, it's almost as essential as corporate security or the other security regimes that you can drive. Now, what are the things that you can do? My thinking is that the future of product security is going to be very immersive in nature. So if you look at how Googles and Facebooks of the world have evolved, they don't have separate security organizations anymore. What they have is they have embedded their security resources across their entire enterprise. So these guys are working alongside product creation, publishing their security requirements when the products are getting envisioned right at that point, not later in stages, right? Facebook does not even have a CISO. Google does not even have a enterprise CISO, right?
Facebook had it, so they fired the guy.
Yeah. But now they don't have one anymore, right? They figured this is a better model to work. I think that when you think about product security, you have to think about three very critical things. So you have to think about embedding a program for static application security testing, or SAST. You have to think about a program for dynamic application security testing, or DAST. You have to think about what Gaurav said before, a manual application penetration testing frequently and often, so that everything that was missed from SAST and DAST is caught and mapped. Yep. Those are the three fundamentals. One last thing I would say here is there are still gaps in the overall product security activities, right? Because the technology for product development is evolving a lot faster than the technology for security. So there is now the whole conception of heavy containerization of security. If you look at older security platforms, they are designed for large behemoth code which you dump into it and they spit out the vulnerabilities that they found. There are new interesting companies that are coming out in the marketplace that are heavily focused on the containerization, the microservices type of stuff, so that, particularly with SaaS companies and things like that, right? So that they can do security due diligence like before in this new world order in which the old security tools don't fit anymore. One last thing here, there is a company right here in Frisco, talking about companies in Texas. It's called Asset Panda, and it's a startup which is focused on creating assets inventory. Yep.
And I just want to touch on that because it raises a really good point about where startups can benefit, to your earlier question. Mm-hmm. You know, when we're looking at disruptive technology like containers and microsegmentation, software-defined everything, you know, the established players don't have a natural motivation to disrupt their own markets. Mm-hmm. And so it presents such an opportunity for startups to come in and kind of fill those gaps and provide the kind of solutions that the emerging technology demands versus the legacy technology. And that's where I see today a little bit of a, you know, I don't see it happening as effectively as it has in the past.
I mean, I think from my experience, I can tell like a lot of security startup founders, right, are trying to ride the waves of technology adoption, right? Whether it is container adoption or productivity or IoT, right? I think like everybody's trying to ride that technology wave, and the implication of that, and what is the security implication? They're trying to solve stuff around that, right? But I think like if we can start with Anand, like, do you have a process today on how you engage with companies? Like, what does that look like today for you, right? As in, like, if like you gave the example too, right? Frisco, Asset Panda, right? Like, I think, what's the set expectation within your organization on? Are you in the mode of like, I need to first figure out what my problem is and then go seek information around it and then identify a company, right? And what does that process look like? And like, how likely are you to open the doors up for saying like, okay, I would invite, like put out an RFP and consider startups as well, right? And if you have a process like that, but then also talk about like, what are the red flags, right? Like what things do you not like, right? When you're engaging with founders, right? Is it behavioral, cultural? Is it like, hey, there's something missing in the team? Like if you could just elaborate a little more on like, what are the deal breakers for you when you're trying to consider startups, that'd be awesome.
Absolutely. So Abhijit, I think that being a maturing company ourselves, we have a natural inclination for companies which are executing well and have a vision. So to me, actually, that's a plus. It's not a minus. The second factor that it helps is, we are a maturing company. Sometimes we don't have the wherewithal and the assets to buy really expensive solutions. I get that leverage and opportunity with companies who are up and coming to build a mutual partnership where they can benefit from us and we can benefit from them. So I keep a very open-minded about that. In terms of red flags, I'm always looking for a well-functioning product. That's my minimum starting point. It may not cover everything, but it needs to function well, and it needs to solve a problem. If it is a product that will be built out for me later, I will wait for that later until I engage with them. My interest also is in working with their product and founder group to understand what is their mentality, thinking, and mindset. Because I'm making a bet. Yeah. If I'm making a bet, I better be sure. And one of the ways to increase the odds of success when you are making a bet is to talk with the people who are building the product. I want to get a sense of, are you executing well? What kind of team and what function that you have built out? What is the profile of your average team member? What is your vision? It's good you have a starting point here. It works well for us. How are you going to continue to evolve this product, right? Maybe a couple of other closing comments I would make is that we are in the cloud. Cloud native is extremely important for us. So that's kind of another, if you're not cloud native, most likely it is not going to work for me. I am going to work the other way. If you are cloud native, that's great. Maybe you can also help me on the corporate side, right? But not the other way, that you can help me on the corporate side and maybe I will use you in cloud native because it doesn't work that way. The one last thing I would say here is that the vision side of it, it's extremely critical for me because things evolve very, very rapidly in cybersecurity space. What is risk threat today will change tomorrow. And if that product group doesn't have the vision to continuously evolve the product, has not built that methodology and cycling within their organization to quickly deliver something new, that's probably lesser of a chance that I will adopt them.
I mean, it's fascinating. Your last point, right? Are you giving them a test every time you meet them to see like how their thought process is evolving? Like, or do they need to come back to you and say like, hey, do you know that particular hack? If you used our product, it wouldn't have happened. Like, what kind of validation do you get on the fly in a continuous fashion? Right? Yeah,
so I think a couple of things. First, I do want to have an insight into their product roadmap to see whether they understand the threat matrix, the attack surface, and the basics. If I know more than they know about that product, that's a problem, right? So then they should know more about it. They should be teaching me, not me teaching them, right? So I think that's one specific aspect about whether they have the proper vision or not. I think the second thing is that we are very metrics driven. We collect tremendous amount of data. Our yearly data capture for security is somewhere in the range of 200 terabytes. Think about that, right? So we are very data rich, and so whether their product is functioning well or not, or whether it is failing in such circumstances, we'll share that feedback with them. But after I share the feedback, we have done a favor to them. So I'm looking for that enhancement and transformation in their next release of the product to handle the feedback that I shared with them.
Well, I'd say when we look at a company, there's always a difference in a startup, whether you're a feature or a product, you know. So many of these companies are looking to get some kind of critical mass they can demonstrate to the acquirers. And for us, that's really bad because the acquirers tend to be our competitors. And so we don't want to have security infrastructure that's taking our money and giving it to a Dell or a Cisco or someone like this. So that's one of the first things we look for is, does this company actually have a vision to be a company? And the second thing is, do they have the wherewithal and the ability to do that? Do they have the ability to build operational processes that scale to our size? Can they sustain those, or do, not just a product roadmap, but a talent roadmap? And where are they going as a company? It's always a red flag when there's just no vision for that, and you can tell that they're just sort of trying to get a few reference customers, get acquired, and get out of the industry.
Drew, that's such an amazing contrast here, right? Because my needs from a startup world are so dramatically different than your needs, because I don't care whether you get acquired or you stay independent, right. But it's really important to you because of the kind of business that you are in, right? So
is it on? All right, cool. So I guess to the second part with the challenges, kudos to Abhijit or Anand and Drew. They stole all of my talking points. Totally agree with them. I think if getting to know with the founders, what their vision is, what's in it for them, how much are they really tied into that organization is important. It's not just the quality of the product, but it is also who are the people backing into the product. So I won't go into too much detail there, but as far as identifying the startups that we work with, I think organizational innovation is a key component to it. Obviously we don't want to be slammed by emails and voicemails and so on and so forth from all these vendors who are trying to sell us the next silver bullet or doohickey, if you will. So we want to be really smart about how we really engage with these startups. First is we want to be able to see what are we doing today and how can we do that better, right? And I've run innovation teams where we're constantly evaluating and reevaluating what we do today and how we can do better. And are there any tools and functions that we can leverage to be able to do that, right? So there's this, our architects, we have 6 to 8 week innovation sprints where we go in and say, okay, how can we solve this particular problem? And here's the pathway to it. Who are some of the companies that are actually providing some capabilities within this function? And then based on our prioritization of how well they do what they do, and this is again, internet search, right? I mean, we're not talking to these companies at this point. We're just reading their white papers. We may talk to a sales engineer over the phone. We may reach out to some other research organizations like the Forresters and the Gartners of the world and say, hey, what do you think? Have you even heard about this, right? If they have, then great. If not, all the more better, because they're so far under the radar that we can actually influence their design on how to do what we need to do. So, so once we have, as a result of those innovation studies, we'll reach out to these organizations saying, hey, how about we do a POC, right? And this POC is completely independent of what we do. There's no guarantees of whether we're going to do into this business. And it's a rapid prototyping. I'm not talking about a 6-month POC. I'm not talking about, hey, let's integrate this within our environment and see what the results are going to be. I'm talking about a week-long POC and see, hey, what can we get out of it? Right? And your POC is only going to be as successful based on the use cases that you've actually provided. What is the specific problems that you're trying to really solve? So hope that helps on one context. And the other one, if your organization is large enough, I've had the fortunate enough to work with some of the bigger organizations where we actually directly engage with some of the universities, the bigger universities in the country, and sponsored research there on problems that that we need help in solving. And these are very well-known universities. Of course, it took a little bit of more money, actually a lot more money, but we were able to sponsor that research and get the technology that we needed to solve our real-world issues as well. So just a pointer there.
Yeah, so it's performance at scale for us and experience. So vision and those things are important, but we're large organization, large enterprise, real time, always on, very high SLAs, strict SLAs with our clients from a contractual perspective. And that's the challenge that we hit almost every time with these smaller organizations, is that we become a test bed for them. And it's really, regardless of vision and strategy and the people, if you can't operate at scale, you can't help us.
I think amongst the challenges founders have, right? I think, would you say a role that you play, and I'm starting with you at Epsilon, right, is also being the shepherd of making the reality real to the founder, right? In terms of like, hey, I think we were talking outside, how you have a way of inviting a conversation, but also sharing what your expectation is. In that same breath, like, is it something that you think will evolve over time, right? Like, how do we solve the problem in the future? Does it come with like leaders like yourself, like kind of rethinking on how to invite startups into their companies and achieve outcomes together, right? I mean, so that's why I think the best outcomes will come from founding teams who can actually go embed themselves, right, in organizations like Gaurav's, right, or Anand's, or any of the larger organizations which say like, hey, here are a bunch of problems we want to get solved, right? Can you help us solve it? And the smartest founders would probably go do it like at 5 different companies across different industries and build something which is super valuable, right? And so in that realm of thought, like, what is your thought process in the future that you look, because the importance of security is not going away, right? But what is troubling is the number of founders who are saying like, oh, I'm going to start a company, they build a product for 2 years, and then they realize there's no demand for that product, right? And at the end of the day, like the investor is just like, oh, so you build something, you know, investors are sold on vision and team, right? And you're saying like, hey, you need to perform, right? So what is that magical bridge that both parties need to come towards where you can enable that?
There's a couple of different challenges in what you're talking about. The biggest challenge that we run into is a startup needs to be able to tell me what problem they're solving, and you'd be surprised how many times I've sat in a meeting for 20 minutes and I don't know what they're talking about or what they're trying to sell. So tell me what the problem you're solving is, what the problem you're not solving is. I think that's number one. I think number two is I have an existing infrastructure and environment. I spend a lot of money on tools and processes and people. How does your solution, your product service work in my environment? How to connect it to what I'm doing? Because I can't, does it augment, does it replace, does it save me money? So tell me that story. And I think the last piece is you've got to have experience on the team. So I think this part is important. If you have a good young team that has good developers, it's needed, but you have to have somebody that's worked in the industry. I'm not trying to get a job here. I'm just saying you've got to have somebody involved with your organization that knows how to do this and deal with the shareholders and stakeholders and all the different things that you have to deal with. The IT world and the security world kind of diverged, I think, 10, 15 years ago because people reacted and thought they had to build big security teams. I think the opportunity is these need to converge, and we need to stop having separate conferences for security and IT and stop having these separate functions and figure out how do we start bringing these things together. And I think if I'm talking to a startup now, I'm telling them, how do you solve that problem for me, for the real world, and you've got a good opportunity.
So the disadvantage of sitting in the middle is that somebody's taken your points before you, and this time it was Robert. The advantage is that your thoughts are actually confirmed. So I'm grateful for you guys to share your thoughts, and you know, in a way, I'm glad that there's some concurrence over here as well. So I think what I totally agree with what Robert was saying here. Why did the dot-com bust happen? I think there were problems, there were solutions being created without problems being in front and center of it. And there was a website for something. People didn't know what to do with it, but there was a website that was being created, and suddenly you had these people. And I was part of that generation. I mean, I was literally in college at that time when the whole dot-com boom was happening, and there was these websites that were just appearing out of nowhere, solving a problem that didn't exist, or having a solution for a problem that didn't exist. So for the startups to be really having meaningful products and services is to understand what the business issues are. Because eventually what we're looking for as information security is we as being enablers to the organization. And I give it as an example that exists. If you look at a high-performance sports car, a Porsche, a Ferrari, you look at the size of the brakes on that darn thing. They're huge. Why are they huge when the whole intent of that car is to go fast? Because it's the brakes, because you can brake later and be able to make the turn that you need to make. So infosec organization needs to be those big, giant breaks on a high-performance organizations that can actually allow the organization to execute faster. Because if we are being disablers to the organization, we are essentially preventing, sort of, shooting ourselves in the foot. We're preventing an organization to be successful that we are part of. So, advice to startups: understand what the business problems that we're trying to solve. And if you can actually help solve those business problems may not always be technology business problems. They may be process problems. They may be integration issues. They may be just human psyche issues. But you got to think about it from an entire holistic end-to-end perspective, where technologies may be 10, 20, 30% of the whole problem, versus a lot of startups thinking that, hey, if I put this silver bullet in your environment, I will solve 90% of the error. No, it'll actually create 90% of the problems, because it does not have the integration and the understanding to solve the business issue that we're trying to solve. Sometimes businesses actually say, hey, data needs to be protected. But guess what? We live in such an integrated society today that no one business can actually exist by themselves. They have to be in a position to be able to share the data that they need in order to be successful. So the solution that needs to be put together is, how do we do that securely, yet efficiently, and more real time as possible, so that we can realize a business solution for the business. So hope that helps, and I'll pass it on to Drew.
Sure. Well, I guess to your original question, I guess I'm lucky in a sense. My company, I think we're the original startup. We are the garage in Silicon Valley. To this day you can visit it.
I live down the road from that garage.
Actually, you live in a very nice house, I must say then. And the reality is, we have a venture arm as part of our company. We've built a system to work with startups. And I think that's good advice for companies of any size. Working with startups out of a functional area makes a lot of sense. You can provide a lot of guidance and a lot of experience and really put the rubber to the road. But there's a lot of other areas, to your point, where the founder needs insight, whether it's how to deal with the bureaucracy of procurement, how to get paid, how to live in the context of enterprise timelines, service levels, et cetera. And so having a structured organization that exists in order to deal with startups generally and act as an incubator that can flow that incubated startup into the business is a really, to me, it's a powerful advantage, and one I think that others, even smaller companies, could easily mirror.
Gaurav, I find it hard to believe that you grew up in .com generation. I think it's much older than that. So, but more seriously, guys, I think
Do I
that
take that as a compliment, or maybe I need to get some skincare?
I think I have just one small addendum to everything that was said before. It's really important for us, for the founders to get deep insights in the industry from the industry that they want to influence. There are 2 or 3 ways to get those deep insights. One way is to create a advisory board from people from those industries, so that they can influence the product decisions and the choices that you are making. That advisory board needs to be composed of people who are who have perceptions and insights about what is happening in that industry. Typical members of that advisory board may be CIOs or CISOs or chief technical architects, etc., who can provide insights from their industries to the startups. I think along the same lines, I think when they get to the point of making a board for themselves, that board needs to have proper representation from the industries that they are trying to conquer. The third key item that I would mention here is that always have a pulse on the marketplace. That's really, really important, because if you think about it, the way Facebook got its pulse on the marketplace was because they had this, I'm blanking out the name of the product, but they acquired a product that was really popular among teens. So that's how they saw when WhatsApp downloads started increasing pretty dramatically, from hundreds to thousands to tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands to millions. And they acquired WhatsApp based on the data that they had. That was their pulse of the marketplace. Similarly speaking, the companies need to have some sort of a pulse of the marketplace, always have conversations going on, traveling all over the place, talking to the people that they have deployed to. Having that pulse allows you to build a better product.
I think, we're just about at time, right? Probably a little over. Thank you. Fascinating insight.